Romance is one of those daunting, old-fashioned words that we don't really use in everyday conversation anymore. It was introduced to many of us at a young age in the form of Valentine's Day, crushes and cooties, or dating. It was something kind of embarrassing. To be romantic, though, can be so much more than that. It can be taking joy in everyday life. It can be stopping to enjoy the beauty of the world around you, or engaging with all 5 of your senses. The Romantics, those poets who were so enamored with the sublime, would spend hours writing poems about a flower that they saw on their morning walk. Romance in this more broad definition, though, isn't as common anymore, and this is an example of language evolution reflecting cultural change in the world around us. However, romance in this original sense of the word is a key component of many of the works that come out of Studio Ghibli. I find that every world, every character in Studio Ghibli is so full of romance in this life-affirming way that when I go away from watching one of these films, as the credits roll, my cup is filled up with a lust for life that was not necessarily there before. I'm reinvigorated with my passion for humanity and for the beauty of nature and beauty of the mundane. So I want to share some of that passion with you by talking about my favorite movie. A movie that embodies romance in every sense of the word, Whisper of the Heart. Whisper of the Heart is one of Studio Ghibli's non-Hayao Miyazaki films. It's also one of their lesser-known films, which is honestly a little bit ironic because it might have one of the most iconic stills to come out of this studio, and that is the picture of the girl studying that accompanies many of the lo-fi beats to chill/study to compilations on YouTube that we've all seen. Don't pretend like you haven't. It came out in 1995, it was adapted from a manga, and is one of Studio Ghibli's only films to receive a direct sequel, which we're not going to get into because that might be a bit of a rabbit hole or maybe a cat hole, I don't know what you'd call that. Not going to go there. Whisper of the Heart follows Shizuku, who is a 14-year-old girl, as she discovers her passion for writing, as she navigates cram school and boys and crushes for the first time. There's no big stakes in this film, which is kind of nice. It's very slice of life. But embedded in every action, every frame, is a great feel for romance. Shizuku's character, the way she moves through the world, her childlike wonder and grown-up awareness, provides the eyes through which we see the story. Think of the moments in the movie when she sees a blimp that has like a positive message and immediately echoes it and says, "Today is going to be great." She's super observant of her surroundings and notes upon taking a shortcut that, oh, I'm right above the library. She notices and befriends a random cat riding the train with her. She mirrors all of our younger selves struggling with her emotions because she's young. But while watching, we root for her to keep feeling them deeply, even through difficulties. Her life is full of the kind of pre-digital serendipity that we can't help but yearn for. She's always buried in books, always losing or forgetting things in her cluttered apartment, just like her mother. And lots of her interactions are based on things, or things she finds interesting. We think of the moment in the movie when Shizuku goes down to a basement full of old men jamming on their handmade instruments and they spur her on to sing Country Roads. There's a stamp on a book that she's reading denoting its previous owner, which leads her to conversations with her older teachers. She takes a bumpy train ride, and there's clothes hang-drying outside her apartment. Perhaps it's a difficult hill that you have to ride up on a bike, or lunch that you bring your dad at work. Objects carry sensory histories. This is different from our ever more digital world. Even this video has a transience, a forgettableness, unlike if I was in the same room talking to you now. It's an underlying theme of new technological frontier. Annoyance and hesitation against her father digitizing library records, an offhand comment by her mother that, "We need another laptop." In the background of Whisper of the Heart is this lingering omen of the computer. This frontier that I'm talking about interestingly reflects the production of animated films in the 90s. Digital technologies began to supplement the arduous hand-drawing process that was associated with many animated films before this. Whisper of the Heart was, however, made all using hand-drawn techniques, so much so that the time-grueling crunch associated with many of these films might have even contributed to the death of one of the directors of this film, Yoshifumi Kondo. A reminder that romance is not without its hardships, and even its tragedies. similar to another Studio Ghibli classic, Kiki's Delivery Service, in which Ursula finds herself through creativity. Shizuku's journey into writing, her encouragement and warnings at the hands of various mentors, her absorption with books, is a romantic depiction of art and identity. But it's not the film's only example, as I mentioned, and it's also not always pretty. In fact, this romance for art is the source of Whisper of the Heart's only real conflict, Seiji having to move away because of his violin-making apprenticeship, and it's presented as a constant symbol of tragedy. I also think of how Shizuku's long creative process to write her first story didn't end in a masterpiece, rather a stepping stone to knowing herself. Shizuku's story is one of star-crossed lovers, and the newly repaired antique clock also tells a story of a prince and a fairy destined never to be together. Concrete Roads, a remix to the iconic Country Roads written by Shizuku for her graduation song, is a funny but sad kind of yearning for a different life, or a disappeared life, which is constantly juxtaposed through the film's visuals of its city. There are highways, the concrete school, steep stairs, geometry, in contrast with distant greenery, those classic blue Ghibli skies and Shizuku's dreams of flying. The Tokyo presented in this film has a really great verticality to it. Characters are always looking down the hill at one another, or riding up the hill on their bike. They're looking out over a vista of shimmering city lights. There's a real magic in the density of the city and in the urban design. The city is presented as the people's art project or playground, and it's a result of creative living. I think of the scene where Shizuku runs up that little alleyway and she's like, I'm gonna go on an adventure, finally, and then she enters into just a normal cul-de-sac, but it does bring her on this adventure, and she goes into this antique store where things are real, like it is the real world, but it's magical to her. Often I think about how it contrasts to in Spirited Away when Chihiro crosses the bridge into the magical, supernatural world that her adventure takes place in, but Shizuku is just going up an alleyway, just taking a shortcut, and that's really lovely to me. I find this film really invites you to believe in your own city's magic. As well as being a coming of age, a paean for the creative process, and inspiration for thousands of YouTube lo-fi playlists, Whisper of the Heart is also a romance. It's one of those portraits of first love which reminds you of how those embarrassments and joys felt. There's a lot of blushing. And this might seem like a disconnected strand to end the video on, but the romance here is so entwined with those already described that it's almost like a case study for how tactile living and believing in art with one's whole heart and hands forms relationships. The meet-cute between Shizuku and Seiji is facilitated by the signed checkout cards attached to every library book they read. It's an example of material serendipity, those pre-digital footprints that we left behind to be discovered by others and would often lead to new friendships. Shizuku leaves a book on a bench and then Seiji comes along and picks it up and opens it up to read it, and it's a open yet private part of herself, and then when they have that exchange, it's something that wouldn't necessarily result from leaving behind an ebook. I think of when he shouts, "Bye, Shizuku," and she says, "How did you know my name?" "Take a wild guess," he says. And it's not because he was a mind reader, it was because it was written down, it was physically on a card in that book. Shizuku's older sister, maybe less idealistic, is still shown writing love letters, and then Shizuku's friend receives one, and these early flirts definitely still exist in the age of digital messaging and social media, but don't they lack the intimacy? I also think about the moment when the two characters are riding up the hill on the bike together. That's just so tactile, you can feel it. And then when Shizuku goes down to the violin workshop for the first time, it's really being invited into somebody else's material world. It's so different than just inviting someone to follow you on Instagram. When you invite someone into your home or into a space that has a lot of meaning to you, it's so personal and intimate, and it's romantic. Every time I watch this movie, it makes me want to write a book, learn how to play the fiddle, or learn how to carve a fiddle, or work in a library. Sometimes I think our love of Studio Ghibli is a little bit misplaced, that we yearn for the aesthetic of the aesthetic. that it's hard to learn the lessons. These might be surface-level takeaways, but the aesthetic does go deeper. With romance, with Whisper of the Heart, I do think it's possible to consider our own lives without taking too much of a leap. Think about how much beauty there is around us, built and natural. And think about how much attention we pay to it. I take a lot of inspiration from the way Shizuka meets the old antique store owner. She goes out on a limb to talk to him. She follows a cat, she follows an intuition. She goes somewhere new and falls in love with a small, weird old statue. She talks to the owner and steadies his little stepladder. She struggles against her passion for a while, and when she commits to it, that's far from without its tensions, and the film's understanding of the difficulties of art are far from simple. But it's ultimately worthwhile. Pretty much everything is.